All right, let's wade into some business news now. And joining us, as he always does on a Tuesday morning, the Chief Investment Officer at the Motley Fool, Scott Phillips. Scott, good to see you. So we'll start with the former Federal Reserve Bank of New York president who's warning the US could go into recession.
Yeah, but it's not the news we wanted first thing on a Tuesday morning, is it? The reality is he's saying every single time the US unemployment rate has risen by more than 0.5%, through history, we've seen the US go into recession. That's a pretty stark one. Now, we should say the data is only 100 and something years old in terms of real, reliable data, but every time the unemployment rate's gone up by that much, we have had trouble. At the moment, US unemployment's risen by 0.2%, but expected to go up a full 1.1% on the Fed Reserve's own forecasts. So William Dudley saying, well, every time this has happened before, we've had a recession. This time around, we may be lucky to avoid one. On the flip side, mate, US GDP is really strong. And I've got to say, it is probably the shining light globally at the moment, at least, for economic growth. Whether that's some bounce back growth, whether there's real consistent demand there in the US to keep that number high is an open question. So on one hand, we've got William Dudley saying history says every time this has happened, we've had a problem. On the other hand, we're in a pretty solid position, or the US is anyway, GDP-wise. Now, that matters a lot to Australia for a whole lot of reasons. Those same trends don't necessarily apply here at home, by the way, but we have relied, and we are relying on the US to be a meaningful contributor to consumption growth over the next 12 to 18 months to keep us on an even keel as well. So where the US goes, as we've always said, when the US sneezes, Australia catches a cold. That is the risk this time around as well.
OK, let's get to these comments that are interesting by the former Treasurer Peter Costello this morning. He says that Australia's extremely high immigration is to blame for driving rents and inflation higher. Is he wrong?
I don't think he is, mate. I think he's pretty much, on the button. And this is going to become, I tweeted yesterday morning, actually, I think this is going to become a really significant political issue if the government doesn't address it. Now, I'll leave the politics to somebody else, but economically, the reality is we brought in 500,000 people this year alone with 2 months still to go. Now, Peter Costello makes the point, look, let's assume they're families. Let's assume there's 2.5 people a family. That's 200,000 new dwellings required to house these people. We already have the lowest vacancy rate amongst comparable countries at somewhere between 0.9 and 1.2%. When you've got more demand coming in and supply can't just keep up at all, let alone grow meaningfully to try and push that vacancy rate up, there is a very real challenge around the number of people we can sustain in terms of that growth. Costello saying in his term, 120,000 people was the annual average intake. We're now at 4 times that, over 4 times that, maybe 5 by the time we end the year, taking 5 years worth of immigration in a single year. Yes, there's some COVID so-called catch-up people like to highlight. The problem is we're not catching up from a very high vacancy rate or from surplus capacity. We are adding people, unfortunately, at the wrong time. Now, as you've said, and as kind of Peter Costello suggests, there is a very significant economic reality here. The bigger political issue, it becomes very ugly very quickly when people start to grasp onto that, and then it becomes a bit of a flashpoint politically and socially if the government and opposition can't address this one in good faith.
So the cynical view, and Matt Canavan, I know you want to leave the politics out of it, but the cynical view is that that more tax receipts. It's better for the government with more people in the country.
Yeah, more GDP as well, right? So we know, we talk regularly about GDP. If they can keep people in the country, you're right, more tax collection and the fact they get to say, look, the economy is still growing. We're effectively already in a per capita recession. So, whichever cynical view you want to take, I think, by the way, I'm sure both those numbers are part of the government's calculus. There's a very, very large debt. GDP is already faltering. We just talked about the risk with the US potentially going into recession. If you're a government and you were being a little bit cynical, you might say, let's just leave that one till later. The problem is it's going to drive inflation higher. It's going to drive rents higher. It's going to potentially, create more homelessness or risk thereof.
Yeah.
Those will be political problems the government may have to deal with if it takes the sugar hit now and has to deal with the hangover.
Yeah, well, I mean, people, if in a year's time they can't find a place to live, there's an election. So that's where it could become a problem for sure. Scott, we'll leave it there.